Next came the pitch. Blockbuster approached Nintendo and Sega with the idea.
Oh, they gonna say no, sorry, Bob. Now, Sega, maybe. Nintendo? Let me know in the comments. Is Nintendo gonna say yes to this idea? The Nintendo that we know.
Angel Knot.
Salutations to the nations. What's good, Angel Knots? It's your boy, Young Sinai. So today we're going to be watching a video titled The Sega Game Factory, an experiment in on-demand video games, well ahead of its time. It is created by Almost Something. So go make sure that you check them out and show them some love. All right, without further ado, let's get to it.
If you were my age, you remember renting games from Blockbuster, begging mom or dad for a chance to play that hit game that you didn't have, beat a game.
Yes, if you didn't have Blockbuster, I was just talking to my kids about this. If you didn't have Blockbuster when you were a kid, man, your childhood is a L. I'm sorry.
Game in 3 days, or at least have something to play with your best friend while they slept over. Well, do you remember the Sega Game Factory? Probably not, but
I do not remember the Sega Game Factory. I was mostly a Super Nintendo kid, okay? I had friends who had Sega Genesis, one across the street, one down the street. I eventually had a Sega Genesis when my parents divorced and my mom had one over her house. But for the most part, I kind of grew up as a Super Nintendo kid. Let me know, have you heard of Sega Game Factory?
its promise was impressive. If it was fully enacted, it would have given you the ability to download and play any game you wanted. Using the Game Factory, you could insert a blank, rewritable cartridge, then play the Sega game of your choosing. The promise was fantastic.
Whoa, hold up. Let me hear that again.
And the writable cartridge play any promise was impressive. If it was fully enacted, it would have given you the ability to download and play any game you wanted. Using the Game Factory, you could insert a blank, rewritable cartridge, then play the Sega game of your choosing.
Yo, that's hard. That's hard. Yo.
Promise was fantastic, and the potential of on-demand gaming, something we all know today, was well ahead of its time. However, changing technology and a lack of corporate follow-through killed the innovative idea. The wild thing about Game Factory is this. It actually showed innovation well beyond what you would expect for a company like Blockbuster and like Sega, both of whom basically got innovated out of the business. It's 1990. Blockbuster, founded in 1985, is continuing to show explosive growth in the movie and video game rental market. The company had between 1,200 and 1,300 stores across the nation, is sponsoring college football games, and buying up its rivals, like Errol's. Blockbuster's success is driven by more than just renting movies. Between 1987 and 1988, the company began to rent out video games. Stores began to draw, on average, around 10% of their profits from video game rentals, although some stores reportedly earned as much as 40% of their profits from the practice. In the early 1990s, the video game rental market, in total, was a more than $1.5 billion.
Wasn't it Nintendo, I think, that was trying to sue Blockbuster? I'm pretty sure it was Nintendo. And they couldn't get them on having people rent their games, but they were able to get Blockbuster caught up because they were illegally copying the game manuals, I believe. Fact check me on that. Let me know if I'm wrong.
Enterprise. The practice was not without significant controversy for video game companies like Nintendo. Nintendo actually lobbied Congress for protection from video game rentals, but
yo, I promise, I have not seen this yet, and that just confirmed that Nintendo was indeed the ones. Nintendo be some haters, man. I can't stand Nintendo. Even though I love their games, I cannot stand them as a company.
But that deal fell apart. In light of that failure, Nintendo wound up suing Blockbuster for copying their instruction manuals. Not joking.
I told you.
Have a video on that one, link in the description. Blockbuster and game rentals were here to stay. However, the practice had problems from Blockbuster's perspective. I've seen information that
yo, she got that 1980s hair. Let's run that back. Look at that.
However, the practice had...
Is that 80s hair? Is that late 80s hair or is that early 90s hair? This definitely looks like it would be a background character in Terminator 2. Let me know what you think.
Problems from Blockbuster's perspective. I've seen information that showed that as many as 1/3 of game customers wanted to rent games but couldn't due to a lack of
Terminator 2, that was in the early 90s, so. But I'm pretty sure. Either way.
product and too many people having already rented a game that they wanted. I mean, you probably remember that. How often did you walk into a Blockbuster to get a hot new title only to discover that it was already sold out? As noted by Sega of
Yo, that is 90s at its peak, that shirt right there. I'm going to run it back.
Blockbuster to get a hot new title only to discover that it was already sold out. As
That
noted by
Bugs
Sega
Bunny
of
Tasmanian Devil t-shirt. What y'all know about that, man?
America President Tom Kalinske, quote, with nearly 1,000 software titles available,
That's where they had the clothes backwards like crisscross.
it's tough keeping an inventory, end quote. For companies like Blockbuster, the answer seemed simple, just buy more games. Of course, that didn't really work either, because eventually the game would be out of demand and Blockbuster would be stuck with 20 copies of a game that was years old and no one really wanted. To address these concerns and to innovate a potentially stale business model, Blockbuster enrolled in a series of corporate moves. This included a partnership with IBM, the computing and electronics giant. Enter Soundsational, a company which, in the late 1980s, made networked music kiosks. Customers could use these kiosks to purchase music and have that music burned to a CD or cassette tape. Eager to take advantage of this emerging technology, Blockbuster and IBM purchased Soundsational in 1990. They renamed the company New Leaf Entertainment and assigned it the job of developing the technology and acquiring the licenses necessary from video game companies. Here's the wild thing. As noted in a 1993 article on the partnership, it was explicitly geared around customers who, quote, will want on-demand retailing in stores as they become more familiar with digitally based multimedia technology, end quote. This, in and of itself, is really impressive. This is in 1993, but Blockbuster, a company that has been much maligned for their lack of innovation, saw the writing on the wall and began to invest in on-demand software very, very early. IBM and Blockbuster created Fairway Technology.
They saw the writing on the wall for that, but they didn't see the writing on the wall, to hop on the streaming.
And the job of that business was to develop the hardware, software, and technology which would make an on-demand system work. Blockbuster could create games on demand, charge extra, and avoid having to stock inventory that would eventually go stale. They could, in theory, have an unlimited supply of games to rent out, provided that they had enough machines and blank cartridges to meet demand. Honestly, the idea was genius, and it was well ahead of its time. Keep in mind that the cartridge.
So was they bootlegging? Am I tripping? Was they trying to bootleg? Let me know, am I tripping? Or if they was just bootlegging games.
Cartridges were rewritable, and the data that would be put on the cartridges was kept in a central location using high-speed internet lines for the transfer of information. Customers could come in and use the system, known as the Game Factory, and have the game programmed onto their cartridge. Blockbuster would facilitate the transaction, and the customer would return the cartridge, which could then have a new game written onto it. IBM estimated that out-of-stock music inventory cost $1 billion a year in lost sales. 43% of music shoppers said that they had experienced this condition, and it made sense to assume that rental companies like Blockbuster ran into
Where'd that guy walking so fast? He's like in a hurry, like somebody chasing him.
Similar problems. If the idea worked, it could dramatically expand the music, video, and games that Blockbuster sold in their stores. As such, Fairway Technologies created two cartridges, a 16-bit and a 32-bit. Obviously, the 32-bit cartridges would be used for larger games, although games that required more processing power would not be compatible for the system. Next came the pitch. Blockbuster approached Nintendo and Sega with the idea.
Oh, they gonna say, no, sorry, Bob. Now, Sega, maybe. Nintendo? Let me know in the comments. Hit pause here. Is Nintendo going to say yes to this idea? The Nintendo that we know.
And, if you know anything about the way these two companies operated at the time, what happened next probably won't surprise you. Nintendo said no. As noted earlier, they had sued Blockbuster over game rentals and the illegal reproduction of game manuals. In other words, they hated the video game market. Chalk this one up to their near obsessive desire to control every aspect of game production and sale. Sega, however, was far more interested. Remember, in the early 90s,
I haven't seen this, but I knew that that's how it will play out. Because Sega's always more lenient with that stuff. Even with like fan games, Sega's more lenient.
Sega was looking for every advantage.
That was a crazy, weird looking Sonic. Was that a claymation Sonic? What the heck?
However, was far more interested. Remember, in the early 90s, Sega was looking for every advantage they could find over Nintendo, taking a much more aggressive marketing tack and creating games that appealed to different audiences. Understandably, Sega wanted to
See, Sega does what Nintendo don't, even when it come to business. You feel me?
make sure that the concept worked first, and they required Fairview and New Leaf to reverse engineer a cartridge to do so. Working together, the companies created a system that worked for games, music, and VHS. Said a New Leaf employee, quote, "We built an extravagant demo center that included high-speed VHS duplication, bleeding-edge 4X CD-ROM burners, first-generation digital color printers, and robotics to automate the fabrication and assembly of a complete piece of media with all its packaging," end quote. In other words, the demo worked. Sega games could be flashed onto cartridges in as little as 45 seconds. Sega agreed to a test case, granting Fairview the rights to use numerous first-party
It's crazy. It took 45 seconds back then, and that was like, wow, that went so fast. But now you think about dropping a Sega ROM onto a SD card like that. You don't even split second.
games as part of an experiment to see if the Game Factory would be a commercial success. With a plan in place, the Game Factory was set to launch. Between August 10th and August 15th, 1994, the system launched at 10 locations in Columbia, South Carolina. It was also available at one Blockbuster in Boca Raton, Florida, where New Leaf Technologies was located. The idea, of course, was to see if Game
That dude dressed like the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air.
Factory would sell Sega games. However, it was actually about much more than that. According to published reports, Blockbuster wanted to see if the technology worked, and then potentially use the Game Factory model for future console releases, including the PlayStation and Sega Saturn. After all,
They was like, yo, let us bootleg all y'all stuff.
we're in August 1994. The PlayStation would be released in a few months in Japan, then make its American debut in September 1995. Likewise, the Sega Saturn would be released in November 94 in Japan and May 95 in North America. The Sega Genesis itself was, by now, nearly 6 years old and on its last legs. By all accounts, the idea worked well. Games reportedly sold, and customers were impressed with the novelty of the system. And yet, nothing. No nationwide Game Factory expansion ever occurred. And this begs the question, why? Well, a few reasons. As noted earlier, Blockbuster was able to secure licensing deals with Sega, but not other third-party developers. And that was a problem. Like most console systems, Sega had an extensive network of third-party developers, and if Blockbuster couldn't get access to those games, it would lock them out of a huge portion of the game library. After a time, Blockbuster was able to secure some deals, but by then, Genesis sales were on the decline. Ultimately, it only made a limited number of games available for the Game Factory, including Earthworm Jim, The Lion King, and Spider-Man and Venom: Maximum Carnage. Other systems began to shift away from cartridges and go to CD-ROMs, and those CD-ROMs had extensive copyright protections, which required that New Leaf invest in new technologies to make the Game Factory work. That meant more capital outlay, and Blockbuster didn't want to make the investment.
They didn't want to turn a new leaf. Boom.
Indeed, not making that investment may have been the final straw. Blockbuster was purchased by Viacom in 1994 for $8.4 billion. As part of a larger media empire, Blockbuster no longer had the pressure to innovate that it had in the past. Of course, that would, in the long run, be fatal. In the end, the Game Factory was a novelty. As part of a way of liquidating their inventory, Blockbuster flashed game cartridges once more, then sold them to customers. Today, you can buy Game Factory cartridges on eBay, but it will cost you a minimum of $400, so be prepared to shell out. There's one interesting point to make here. Game Factory wound up being
$400.
emblematic of what helped launch Blockbuster and Sega to begin with. It was a revolutionary idea that provided users with a form of on-demand gaming well before the concept went mainstream. However, a lack of investment, follow-through, and an over-reliance on already existing products killed the idea. Now, a question. Did you ever use or see the Game Factory? If you did, leave us a comment.
Yo, let me know. Did you ever use or see the Game Factory? That was a really good video. I've never heard of that before. I think that it was an innovative concept. It made a lot of sense. Instead of them buying mass quantities of these games and then just having all this leftover stock. Yo, just sell us one and then we'll bootleg that mug. We'll lend it out. You feel me? I mean, we'll pay you for the license. You feel me? I think it was a good idea. Of course, Nintendo's not going to get on board. They hate getting on board with everything. So that didn't surprise me at all. But let me know in the comments if you have heard of this before, if you've used it. Let me know, have you spent $400, $500, $10,000 on a blank cartridge from Blockbuster? All right, make sure you go ahead and check out Almost Something. All right, appreciate you guys. God bless and salutations to the nations. Please make sure that you subscribe. I am on my journey to 1,000 subs, okay? If you subscribe, then you can go to the post and you can see how to win a Trim UI brick that I'm giving away once I hit 1,000 subs. So I appreciate everybody who's been rocking with me. Love you guys. Peace.
Angel Knot.